You have come here perhaps out of curiosity, or perhaps because something in you has stirred at the mention of the word empath. And if you have then know this, we do not gather merely to speak of sensitivities or sentimentality. No, we are gathered here to invoke the ancient patterns that lurk beneath what the modern mind naively calls feelings. When I speak of the empath, I do not speak of a gentle soul, who simply feels what others feel. I speak of a psychic conduit lightning rod, through which the unconscious of the world pours itself, and that is not always a blessing. Empathy, in its most popularized form, is celebrated, yet we must beware of concepts made too easily digestible by the collective. When a thing is popular, it has usually been stripped of its power. The empath, as I have encountered through dreams, patience, and archetypal visions, is not a smiling spiritual caricature. No, true empath is a bearer of weight, a carrier of shadows not their own, and they are often unaware of the forces that have possessed them. To understand this, we must look beneath the personal, beneath even the interpersonal, for the empath is not merely psychologically attuned to others, they are unconsciously vulnerable to the archetypal currents that animate those others. Imagine a village healer in the time of great storms, kneeling in a field and vomiting blood, not because they are sick, but because the land itself has fallen ill. That is an empath. They transmute what they do not own. They feel what was never theirs to carry, and unless they become conscious of this function, they are fated to be devoured by it. In one of my earlier dreams, long before I had the words to define the archetypes, I saw a woman standing on a bridge above a chasm. She had no eyes, her hands were held out in front of her, trembling as though she were both reaching for help and warding something off. Below her in the dark pit were voices, many voices, crying out in despair, in longing, in confusion. The woman could not see them, but she felt them, and her body bore the pain of each cry like a wound. That woman is the empath. Her blindness is not literal, it is the blindness to the origin of her suffering. She does not know where the voices end, and where she begins. She is the psychic sponge, but no one has taught her to wring herself out. There is great danger in being an open vessel without the vessel's wisdom. You see, the unconscious has no moral compass. It is a cauldron both sacred and chaotic. When an empath opens themselves to the psychic material of another, whether intentionally through compassion or unintentionally through energetic permeability, they invite into themselves the unprocessed matter of that person's shadow. And most people walk the earth with shadows trailing long behind them, untouched, unloved, feared. That which is unloved in one person seeks refuge in another, and the empath, if unguarded, becomes that refuge. There is a story from African tribal law, one I encountered in my studies, of a young dreamer who would walk the edges of the forest and hear the cries of spirits who had no name. These spirits would whisper into the dreamer's ears, not with words, but with feelings, sudden waves of grief, of terror, of longing. The dreamer began to weep at odd times, tremble in stillness, laugh when no one had spoken. The tribe, fearing possession, summoned the elder. The elder did not exorcise the spirits. He taught the dreamer to speak with them, to name them. This is the lesson I give to you now. To be an empath without discernment is to become a playground for disowned archetypes, but to be an empath who names what they carry, that is the path of the alchemist. You may think it is enough to say, I feel what others feel. But you must go deeper. Why do you feel it? Where does it enter you? And what are you doing with it? Because empathy can be a subtle possession. The unconscious is a trickster, does not always arrive with horns and flame. Sometimes it comes as compassion so overwhelming that it drowns you. Sometimes it comes as a need to help so compulsive that it destroys your own boundaries. Sometimes it comes as love for a person whose shadow has latched onto your soul and mistaken your body for its graveyard. I have seen empaths fall in love with the very people who are destroying them, not out of weakness, but because they have been unconsciously seduced by the other's wounds. They feel the ache, and in feeling it, they become the caretaker, the savior, the silent sponge. But there is a dark marriage in that, what I have called enantiodroia, the reversal into the opposite. The healer becomes the harmed, the bearer of light becomes the host of another shadow, and the longer this unconscious dynamic persists, the more the empath begins to lose the thread of who they truly are. If you are an empath, you must understand your gift is not simply emotional, it is psychic, and it is archetypal. You are attuned not just to feelings, but to the collective currents that shape humanity itself. When someone enters your presence, it is not just their smile or their tears you register, it is their lineage, their buried gods, their unlived lives. And unless you have made contact with your own unconscious, unless you have traversed the underworld of your own psyche, you will be overwhelmed. There is a temptation in the spiritual world to romanticize sensitivity, to wear it as a badge, but in the world of the soul, no gift is purely light. All light casts shadow, and empathy, perhaps more than any other function, invite shadow to the surface. Do you know what happens when a person represses rage for years? It does not disappear, it waits, it finds a home in the psychic field. And when such a person encounters an empath, especially one who is unconscious of their own unresolved anger, that rage jumps, it leaps like fire into dry wood, and the empath, overwhelmed, may begin to feel irritable, depressed, inflamed, not realizing they are carrying a flame that is not theirs. I once treated a woman who cried incessantly every time she entered my office. Tears flowed before words at first. She believed herself to be wounded by her parents, her lovers, her world, and indeed, there were wounds, but what revealed itself over months of careful descent was this: she had taken on the ungrieved sorrow of her mother, her grandmother, and her lineage of women before her, all of whom were forbidden to cry. She had become the vessel for a generational shadow, and in carrying their sorrow, she had lost the language for her own empaths. If you do not delineate what is yours from what is theirs, you will drown in a sea of unnamed ghosts. The gift of feeling is sacred, but sacredness demands structure. The vessel must be strong enough to contain the fire, otherwise the fire consumes. There is another dream I must share with you. A man stands in a cathedral made of mirrors. He walks, and each step echoes with unfamiliar voices. He turns to look into a mirror, expecting his reflection, but instead sees a weeping child. Another mirror, he sees a screaming soldier, another dying mother. All these faces stare at him, and he does not know who they are. He begins to scream, "Which one is me?" But the mirrors do not answer, they only reflect. This too is the empath, lost in the mirrors of other people's inner worlds, unable to remember the face they wore before they began to feel everyone else's pain. If this resonates with you, you must ask, what work have I done to know myself, not in the way of affirmations or identity labels, but in the crucible of confrontation? Have you stood in your own underworld and spoken to your shadow? Have you acknowledged the parts of you that use empathy to feel important, needed, even holy? Have you faced the dark pleasure that sometimes arises when you are the only one who understands someone else's pain? Yes, even the empath is not exempt from shadow motives. Sometimes the act of helping others is a way of avoiding the self. Sometimes the burden of carrying everyone else's suffering is more comforting than the silence of facing your own. We are strange creatures. We dress our avoidance in virtue, and the unconscious, ever subtle smiles behind the veil. Empathy is not salvation. It is a threshold. To cross it wisely, you must learn the art of boundaries, not the rigid walls of defensiveness, but the porous yet discerning membrane of the individuated soul. To say, "I feel you, but I do not become you." To say, "I see your wound, but I do not house it within my psyche." To say, "I offer presence, not possession." And this, I believe, is the final aim: not to absorb the other, but to witness them. There is no greater tragedy for the empaths than to become invisible to themselves, to be so deeply merged with the suffering of others that their own soul fades into a whisper. And yet it happens every day in marriages where one partner carries the emotions of the other like an unpaid servant, in families where the most sensitive child unconsciously becomes the emotional regulator for an entire household, in therapists, teachers, and ministers who confuse compassion with codependence. This confusion is not benign as archetypal possession. The empath, without the ballast of inner work, becomes absorbed by the wounded healer archetype, also known as Chiron in myth, and when Chiron rises in the psyche unexamined, it demands suffering as a rite of purpose. One begins to believe they are meant to hurt, that their value lies in their capacity to suffer alongside, or even for others. This is a distortion. It is the shadow of the healer complex, where one's identity becomes tethered to pain, not the conscious transformative pain of shadow work, but the endless reenactment of unconscious service to the brokenness of others. The empath loses autonomy not out of kindness, but because the archetype has taken the reins. You must understand archetypes are not metaphors, they are living patterns of psychic energy, older than language, older than history. When you feel pulled to help, when you feel exhausted after entering a room, when you feel elated by being needed, pause. Well, these are not simply your feelings, they may be the voices of invisible forces acting through you. The archetype of the savior, the martyr, the mother, even the seducer, all of these can slip into the unconscious empath and animate them like a puppet on spiritual strings. But puppets do not individuate, they perform to become whole. The empath must begin the dangerous sacred act of separation, separation not from love, but from entanglement, not from presence, but from fusion. This is not coldness, this is warmth with a spine. It is to stand before another's anguish and say, I will not abandon you, but I will not bleed for you. It is to feel the tidal wave of someone's unspoken grief and say, I will sit beside you, but I will not become the ocean. There is an image that arises now, a dream from one of my patients, a forest ancient, entangled with roots that reached like fingers through time. In the center, a stone well deep bottomless around it, sit the empath's men and women, with hands cupped over their hearts weeping, and in the well the shadows of those they love. The empaths peer in hoping that if they cry enough, care enough, they might draw those shadows into the light. But the well has no end and the tears feed it. This too is what happens when empathy becomes compulsive. It feeds the very darkness it hopes to redeem, for there is a secret that few dare speak. Not everyone wants to be healed, not every soul is ready to awaken. And the empath who confuses their gift with responsibility will spend their life trying to pull the unwilling from the depths and in doing so be pulled down themselves. You must discern, does your empathy liberate or entrap? Does your empathy honor the other's path or violate it by insisting they be elsewhere? Even healing can become control when it arises from fear. There are parents whose empathy for their children becomes suffocation, lovers whose sensitivity becomes manipulation, friends whose compassion masks a need to be irreplaceable. All this is the shadow side of empathy, where care becomes currency and feeling becomes power. You may recoil at this, not me, you say, but if you are truly empathic, you must turn that feeling inward. Ask yourself, where has my gift become a mask? Where do I confuse connection with obligation? Where have I made myself essential to others as a way to avoid being alone with myself? This is not judgment, this is the path of integration, for true empathy is not the taking on of another's pain, it is the witnessing of it without losing one's center. It is the art of standing in the fire of another's suffering and remaining unburned, not through detachment, but through deep-rootedness in the self. And what is this self? It is the totality of who you are, not just your feelings, not just your light, but your shadow, your instinct, your history, your future. The self is not an idea. It is the living center of the psyche, around which the archetypes orbit like planets. When the empire finds this center, they cease to be porous. They become anchored, and from that anchor true compassion flows, not as sacrifice, but as strength. But this path is not easy. It demands descent. The empath must go down into the underworld of their own psyche. They must meet the parts of themselves that enjoy being needed, that fear abandonment so much they merge with others to stay safe, that confuse intimacy with enchantment. These are not flaws, these are survival strategies born off deep woundings, often from childhood, when sensitivity was either punished or exploited. I have worked with patients whose empathy arose from trauma, a child who learned to read her father's mood to avoid his wrath, a boy who became hyper-attuned to his mother's depression so he could pull her from despair with a joke or a hug. These children became empaths not from spiritual grace, but from necessity, and that necessity carved into them a hypervigilance that they later called a gift. But a gift that grows from fear must be purified. You must ask, who was I before the world told me to feel for others first? What part of me still believes that love must hurt? What would happen if I no longer absorbed the pain around me? Who would I be? And would I still be loved? These are not academic questions, they are initiatory thresholds. And it is here the empath meets their true test to feel and to remain whole, to open the heart and keep the spine to love without bleeding, to help without hollowing, to see the world suffering. It asks them to stop bleeding on altars that were never meant to hold them. And it demands the terrifying step of letting others feel their own pain. Let me be clear, empathy, when conscious, is holy, but when unconscious it is contamination. It is energetic boundary collapse. It is the flooding of the self by archetypal residue that does not belong, and that residue often runs deeper than we realize. In many empaths we find ancestral entanglement, sensitivity passed down like an heirloom, perhaps once sacred, now burdened. A woman whose great grandmother served as the village medium may, without understanding why, feel overwhelmed in modern crowds. A man whose ancestors were burned for witchcraft may carry an unconscious guilt around his gift of perception, burying it beneath hyper-emotionality, rather than wielding it as a skill. Empathy, then, is sometimes a carrier of ancestral grief, or long echo of unresolved suffering, seeking voice in a sensitive descendant. And unless that descendant awakens, unless they choose to feel with awareness, they become yet another vessel of unconscious repetition. The dreams of these people often reveal archetypal symbols in their most potent forms: serpents coiling around the heart, oceans swallowing small children, ancestral homes burning while the dreamer weeps without water to quench the flame. These are not simply personal symbols, they are the language of the deep psyche, warning you are overfull with what is not yours. I recall another patient, an artist deeply attuned to beauty, pain, rhythm. She brought a recurring dream of walking through an old museum. Inside were sculptures of people she had known, parents, lovers, friends, but each sculpture had a small plaque that read, "Do not touch property of the dead." And yet she touched them anyway, and every time they bled. This dream, I told her, was not punishment. It was instruction. Her empathy had become necromantia constant, reaching into the past, into pain that belonged to another time, another soul. She needed not less feeling, but more discernment. Some suffering is sacred to witness, but some is meant to be buried. Empaths, when unconscious, become gravediggers for the collective abandoned corpses. They walk the psychic battlefield and mistake every wounded soldier for a soul they must save. But not all pain seeks healing, some seeks extinction, and to interfere with that is to play God in a theater we do not understand. So what then are we? To harden our hearts, to turn from the wounded, to protect ourselves until nothing can touch us. Number, we are to refine our empathy, to transform it from sponge to sword, from open wound to listening mirror, from martyrdom to mysticism. The true empath is not fragile. The true empath is initiated. They have walked through the shadow realms and claimed their own pain. They have turned inward and faced their unmet needs. They have spoken with their rage and their shame and their terror, and because of this they no longer confuse empathy with entanglement. They can feel without falling, they can witness without absorbing, they can love without losing. And from that place their gift becomes not a liability, but a lamp. They illuminate without burning, they guide without dragging, they offer presence, not rescue, and most importantly, they remember it is not their job to carry the world. It is their task to carry themselves with such integrity that the world remembers how to carry itself. Now we arrive at the threshold not of despair, but of transfiguration. Everything that has been spoken, everything that has been unearthed from the caves of your inner world now asks for one thing: not admiration, not analysis, but embodiment. The empath who has walked through the dark, who has turned inward with unflinching honesty, emerges not as a broken healer or a perpetual sponge, but as something far rarer, an initiated presence, a living vessel of the self who understands that empathy is not absorption, it is alchemy. It is the fire through which suffering is recognized, not adopted, witnessed, not owned, transformed, but never stolen. When the empath becomes conscious, they no longer enter rooms silently scanning for pain to fix. Instead, they walk as mirrors, not those that reflect back wounds, but those that show others what they have forgotten of themselves. They become what I have called the wounded mystic, not because they continue to bleed, but because their scars have become symbols, symbols of having survived the union with the unconscious and returned with wisdom. There is a subtle danger here, however, because as the empath becomes empowered, another archetype stirs from the deep: the magician, the one who has seen through illusion and learned the secrets of energetic exchange, the one who can speak to another shadow without flinching, But this magician, if not anchored in humility, begins to believe they are above suffering. They become seduced by insight. They turn wisdom into weapon. Empathy becomes manipulation. And the cycle repeats, this time with more clever disguises. So beware, initiation is not a final badge, is a lifelong vigilance. To be a conscious empath is to wake up every day and ask, is this mine? Am I feeling or fusing? Am I healing or controlling? Am I present or performing? These questions are not signs of doubt, they are signs of maturity. The conscious empath is no longer afraid to be unsure. They no longer rush to soothe or fix. They allow silence. They allow the other to be broken without rushing in. As savior, they trust the psyche's own intelligence, knowing that sometimes pain is the doorway, not the enemy. And what of relationships? Here too everything shifts. The unconscious empath is drawn to the wounded, the chaotic, the narcissistic, not because they are naive, but because part of them believes they must prove their worth through endurance. They are pulled to those who mirror their unhealed inner child, the one who learned that love must be earned through suffering. But conscious empath, they begin to crave clarity. They seek out those who see them, not just need them. They build bonds rooted not in trauma, but in truth. And if loneliness comes, they no longer fill it with the ghosts of broken souls. They sit with it. They listen. They let the silence speak. It is here that the empath reclaims their true gift, not as a receptor of pain, but as a revealer of soul. They no longer dim their intuition to keep others comfortable. They no longer contort their boundaries to avoid abandonment. They understand that saying no is not rejection. It is protection of the sacred within. I once dreamt of a lake still silver, infinite along its shore. Stood those I had known, students, patients, even myself at different ages. Each looked into the lake, hoping to find answers, and in the center a single figure wed, untouched by ripple or wind. They spoke no words, they simply were, and everyone who looked into their eyes saw themselves, not their wounds, not their needs, but the image of who they might become. This, I believe, is the destiny of the awakened empath, to become a mirror not for pain, but for potential, to walk not as a martyr, but as a reminder, to feel not everything, but only what is true, to carry not the suffering of the world, but the vibration of integrity. And in doing so, they do not abandon the path of feeling, they transcend it, they transmute it. They become what alchemy has always pointed toward, the union of opposites, the heart and the spine, the open palm and the grounded root, the healer and the human. So if you see yourself in these words, if you have recognized in your own dreams the symbols of overgiving, of emotional hunger, of sacred exhaustion, then I say this not as condemnation, but as invitation. Step back from the shadows that are not yours, turn inward, face silence you have fled, speak to the parts of you that merge to survive, honor them, thank them, and then release them. You are not a sponge, you are not a sacrifice, you are not broken for the sake of others' comfort. You are a living threshold, a place where energy becomes meaning, a place where pain is met, not swallowed, a place where empathy becomes wisdom. And if you can hold this subtle fire, this delicate clarity, then you will not only survive your sensitivity, you will sanctify it. You will walk among the world's ghosts, and no longer be haunted. You will witness pain without performing penance. You will feel without falling, and most importantly, you will return to yourself not as a rescuer, but as a soul